Welcome everybody, thank you for joining. Today we're going to be talking about, is it still safe to be a director? Things have changed, whereas it may have been safer in the past, it's certainly a lot less safe now. And we'll go into the detail of why that is, and hopefully your understandings to date will be changed a little bit. Just confirm, can you now hear me? There's a message here saying can't hear anything. Can you hear me now? Let me know. Can anyone hear me? Chandru, can you hear me now? Great, fantastic. Cool, let's get going. So what I want to talk about today is just certainly give you a bit of an introduction about who Sirdar is, give you an introduction of who I am and why I'm standing in front of you, and then we'll get into the detail of what we mean by high performance board and high performance director, and touch on some of the most important things you need to be aware of as a director. So for those of you who haven't heard us before, Sirdar Group is the global leader in educating, appointing and guiding of high performance boards. And we focus primarily on privately held companies and family businesses, but we're doing a lot more work now with NGOs, government departments, some listed companies, particularly on the training side. Because what we've learned through working with private businesses for the last 10 years is that the same concepts apply to a business of any size. In fact, anything that's registered as a company really has very similar problems. So as I said, we've been doing this for now over 11 years, and we've learned along the way, dealing with hundreds of companies, that the rules of business apply to any business. Despite the product, the industry you're in, the same concepts apply in terms of how you run the business, particularly at a board level. So that's what we're going to get into today. So a little bit about me. I'm originally from the UK. Been in South Africa since 1992, and I was a managing director of a company in the IT industry, but it was predominantly working in asset management and the collective investments industry. And for 11 years when I was running that company, we had a huge board, but because it was an IT company, very few staff. So it took me a while to learn through attending lots of courses what was the point of all of these directors, because a lot of them were shareholder representatives, industry representatives, etc. And then I was the only executive on that board. So it was definitely a learning journey to say, how do I get value from these people in the room? How do I make sure that they are wearing the different hats of shareholder, director, and manager in the right way, and contributing to the way we're running the business from a strategic perspective? What do I want to talk about today? Well, I really want to try and get across the message that there is a distinct difference between a shareholder, director, and manager. And when we're wearing all three hats, it's really difficult to distinguish them. A, because we may not know and understand what the fundamental differences are. And B, because we're wearing them all the time, we don't necessarily know which hat we're thinking with in a particular situation. So I want to spend a bit of time going through that to hopefully unpack why it's so important to be able to understand those different roles and think differently in those different roles. And what I aim to achieve as well today is to really get across an understanding of what the end game looks like. So if you want to go on this journey of becoming a high performance director, what are some of the steps, and be very high level today because we've only got a certain amount of time, but what are the steps you need to take to get there, and some inkling about what that looks like. And if you're a company that hasn't got a board yet, again, understanding why it's important to have one and why it's important to at least start that journey of moving towards a place where you've got what you might call a high performance board. So let's run the poll. If I can get this to work. Poll. I just want to find out a little bit more about who we've got in the audience. So start poll. And I'm just going to publish it. So we've got a few choices. Are you a shareholder? Are you a director, a managing director or CEO, an executive? In other words, you're not one of the three above, or you're more than one of the above. So typically that would be the shareholder manager group, where you're wearing at least 2, possibly even 3 of those hats. Cool, so we've got a few of the more than one aboves. That's great. Hopefully be able to talk to you today. Awesome. A couple more secs. Anyone else who needs to fill it in? Going, gone. So good, looks like a majority of you are in that more than one above, which is fantastic, but a good mix across all the different levels. So hopefully we'll be able to share some information that's valuable to all of you. Okay, so I'm just going to flick back to this because there we go. So what really drives me is the difference between good directors and great directors. And I think there's an awful lot of good directors out there, but very few great directors out there. And the reason why there's such a distinction is a bit like the book Good to Great. The way we see a good director is someone that's really changing lives. And that means that they're driving all of the aspects of the business, and the business is being, as we'll cover in a minute, held at a much more accountable level, so that it's growing to the potential it has, that all of the stakeholders are engaged in that business and we're thinking about them when we're helping drive them forward, particularly at a time like we are now. What are we doing to help and support the communities that are affected by our business, our employees, our customers? How do we help and support all of them to our best ability? And that's a key part of what we need to be thinking about as a director, not just shareholders, as was the case in the past. So before we move on, I'd just like you to jot down why you want to attend today. What were you hoping to get out of it? Because then at the end, at least, we've got some questions that we can answer and see, and just make sure that you've got the knowledge and understanding that you were hoping for. And also, if you've got a big question about a high-performance board or being a director, just jot that down. And again, add it to the chat box at the end so that we can go through those questions and hopefully clear up any outstanding things that you haven't heard during the presentation or haven't been answered during the presentation. So what are we going to do to start with? So let's understand what the end looks like. So the key part of this is to understand what boardroom performance looks like, and we'll talk about that now. And just as Stephen Covey said, unless we know where we're going, unless we know and understand what the end looks like, then it's really difficult to get on the journey and make the right calls about whether you're on track. So a high-performance board, what does it comprise of? Well, we see it as being 3 major components. Obviously, the easy one is director, because if you don't have any directors, then you don't have a board. But the other part, which is commonly forgotten, is that it needs some kind of team and a methodology. So the director is the person in the room, in the boardroom. But in order for them to get the information they need, in order for them to feed the decisions they've made back down to the organization, you really need a team of executives and even support staff at lower levels in the organization that help drive that communication. So if you've got the right information coming to the board in the right way, it makes it so much easier to make decisions. If the team understands the purpose of the board and what they're trying to achieve, and then helps and supports the communication back down into the organization, then again, you get a much more effective process. And the methodology piece is the way you do that. So what are all the different components that make up the pieces of running a board meeting? What is the process that you run through? What are the components of, excuse me, what are the key documentation that you need in place to really make a board effective? In other words, the rules of the game. So for example, it might be something like a board charter, which defines the values of the board. So when a new director comes in, these are the rules that we're playing by. These are the values that we support and live by. And a few other bits and pieces that govern how directors are removed, when the rotations happen, when the board evaluations happen. So anybody coming into the organization as a director, particularly as an independent, has a really good understanding of what the business is all about. And then there's various components that make up a good board process. So the way that you run the meeting, the timing of the meetings, the rhythm and the momentum of meetings, how you draw up the agenda, etc. That's all part of what we would term methodology. So without those 3 components running effectively, it's really, really difficult to have a properly effective board. So what is a high-performance director? So a high-performance director is one who is obsessed with creating meaningful economic impact, and that in our framing, economic means anything that impacts someone's well-being, whether it's monetary or whether it's something else that helps and supports them to have a more comfortable life and satisfy their basic needs. Meaningful economic impact through their role on the board and the role their company plays in the economy. Furthermore, such a director is not afraid to have the tough conversations as well as do the mundane aspects that together enable board success. So key things that pop out of that, our definition is obsessed is really important. As a director, this is not a come to the meeting, go through the agenda, tick the boxes, all good, go home, never think about the company again. You need to be thinking about the company you're a director of all the time. You need to be obsessed about how you can find ways to improve the performance of that organization so that for the next board meeting, you're ready. You're ready with the questions. You're ready with the ideas. You're ready to contribute and add value. And it's that broader context of meaningful economic impact across all of the different stakeholders, not just the shareholders. And not afraid to have the tough conversations is usually what people miss. So if you've got a board made up of representatives from the organization, but they've never really had any training, so they're not fully up to date with what their role is and what their rights are. So it tends to be the founder or the dominant voice, the MD in that conversation who's really driving the agenda and sort of taking the decisions, and the rest of the group sort of goes, yes, okay, that sounds reasonable. Fantastic, let's move forward. Whereas if you've got some differing opinion, it's really, really important. If you are registered, if you're wearing that hat of director, you have to have those tough conversations. You need to stand up. You need to be that lone voice that says, no, hold on, I think we're going in the wrong direction. And the mundane aspects is all of that background stuff that you need to do, the preparing for the board meeting, the reading the board papers, the checking in, making sure you've reviewed the minutes. All of those kind of things are also a critical part of board success. So and what we talk about here is when you're investing in someone else's company. So for example, you've bought shares of a JSE stock exchange listed company. If that company only had one director, would you feel comfortable with that investment? Would you feel that that company was likely to perform at its best? And the answer is typically no. But in our own organizations, and I use that word in inverted commas because you can't own a business, but in the organizations in which we run, it's very common to only have one or two directors. And what's being missed there is that external input, the input from more minds into the strategic conversation. It's not a matter of losing control. It's about building a bigger team that helps and supports you. So there's a reason why we invest in other companies. We expect there to be more than one director, and we inherently know that a board supports the business growth and increases its value, but it's often really difficult or something we've never really looked into and considered properly to do that in the businesses that we are shareholders in or that we are directors and managers of. So a high-performance board is one that through its rhythm and decision-making holds the company accountable to a performance standard higher than it has ever had before, resulting in increased value, improved return for shareholders and other stakeholders on a sustainable basis. So there's lots of key concepts in there. So there's a rhythm about being a high-performance board. We need to make decisions. I've come across companies, in fact, I was speaking to a CEO a couple of years ago who had been on the board as a CEO representing the organization, and they hadn't made a single decision at the board meeting for 18 months. They'd just been through the financials, he'd given his management report feedback, and that was about it. It was ticking the boxes. They hadn't actually sat down and discussed and considered a decision. He'd either been left to make it on his own or things that just hadn't happened. So it's really important. That's a key part of a high-performance board, is to make decisions and properly considered decisions. And holds the company accountable to a performance standard higher than it's ever been held before is about making sure that we are driving an effective strategy. We are making sure that actions are taken against that strategy. And then if it proves that that strategy is wrong because something massive has happened, the situation a lot of companies are in right now, how do we make sure that we revisit that strategy, we pivot, we find a new way as quickly as possible? And we don't sort of dither and procrastinate, and we actually think about it, get the help we need, make a decision, and move forward. And yes, we've got to increase the value and improve return for shareholders. That's a given, because they're putting the money into the business. And if you want the business to grow, the first place you're likely to look for that funding is probably going to be the shareholders. So they need to see that this business is growing and improving and increasing its value. But you also need to make sure that other stakeholders are engaged as well, because that's how you build a sustainable business. It's usually the stakeholder that you haven't been engaging with that's going to cause the biggest problem and potentially have the biggest impact on your business. So this diagram really is trying to represent that all of the components come together. So the director and the boardroom come together to help lift the company performance. And if there's one missing, then particularly if the boardroom in the middle is not effective, then there's no leverage, which means a director can't shift the company performance on their own. They need a properly functioning, well-composed board in the middle that they can leverage off, which really then starts to lift the company performance and make a difference to the organization. And leadership and governance is changing all the time, and it's something we really need to be aware of. Not only is leadership styles changing, but also governance is evolving over time. And we're up to King 4 now, and it's quite different from King 1. The principles are the same, but the approach has moved quite a long way. And a lot of governance overseas has moved from tick box checking, rules-based stuff to much more principles-based, because we've realized that you can't have a comprehensive list of rules. And if you're focusing on just ticking boxes on the rules, then it's not getting across the message that actually governance is much broader than just a list of rules. So it's a continuous work in progress. You need to continue to upgrade your knowledge. You need to continue to read on the subject and watch what's going on, where mistakes are being made in the press, wherever else it might be in your communities, and learn from them and apply them to the organization you're working with to make sure you don't make the same mistakes. So foundations. One of the key things that often gets either never learned, particularly not at school or university or even in life, is this fundamental difference between a business that's set up like a craft and a business that's set up like an enterprise. So what do I mean by that? A craft, in our definition, is like the businesses of old that were started by a master craftsman. They employed craftsmen below them to help support them to get the work done, and then they had apprentices, etc., and lackey to help them grow their business. The problem with that setup is that it's all about the master craftsman or woman. They are driving the business. It's based on their skill and ability, which means that if anything happens to them, there isn't really a business. In other words, the business doesn't have any value in and of itself. The value is in the individual. And so many businesses when they start out are in that situation, because it's a person who's got an idea and they start the business and it's based on their skill and ability to take it forward. There's nothing wrong with that at all, and craft businesses can be highly successful. The difference is understanding that that business itself doesn't have value, which means you need to focus on earning as much as you can per the hour. Make sure you've got all the support people to help you be effective and efficient, and then put that money, put that wealth somewhere else, whether it's property, whether it's shares, wherever it might be. But make sure it's moving out of the company into something else. Because as soon as you want to retire, as soon as you're in difficulties, get sick, die, whatever it might be, that company doesn't really have any value. It's not truly a business of itself. Whereas an enterprise is nothing to do with an individual. Yes, it's driven and created, and the vision comes from an individual. But as far as possible, the operations, the running, the perpetuity of that business is based on a team. And there's a big difference, because that team, that enterprise, has a value. You're building an asset. So it's important to understand which direction you're going in. And if you want to get to the position in the future where you want to sell a business, or you want to bring in additional shareholders and get some money out of the business, then you need to make sure you're building an enterprise and not a craft, and start as early as you possibly can on that journey. So even if there's just one of you or two of you or three of you, you can make a decision to say, okay, I'm going to build a craft or I'm going to build an enterprise, because it affects the decisions that you make along the way. Am I bringing in someone who knows more than me to form a better team, or am I bringing in someone who's going to help and support me to do better in what I do? So make a decision and then go with it. But understand the difference and understand where you're going to create wealth across those two different business types. And where does that come from, that word entrepreneur or enterprise? So both words come from the same root. And the root is, they come from a French word, entreprendre, which means to undertake. It's to make a promise. So as an entrepreneur, we make a promise to the market. So we are telling the market, this is what I'm going to give you. This is the outcome I'm going to help and support to achieve, whether it's a product, whether it's a service, whatever it might be. I'm promising something. The enterprise then holds that promise. So without the enterprise to hold that promise and take it to market and make sure it's delivered effectively, then, as I said, the entrepreneur ends up being in a craft because they're doing all the work. And they have no sustainability and longevity because they're doing all the work. So it's really critical to understand and make sure that as an entrepreneur, you're communicating what that promise is, that undertaking, and then making sure the enterprise understands it and is built into all of your systems to deliver it as effectively as possible. So let's get into some questions. What is the role of a director? So there's three components that make up that role. Strategy is one of them. So this is often misunderstood in that there's a common conception that management come up with strategy and the board just sort of rubber stamps it and says, yes, okay, fine. What the board needs to do is own the strategy. So management and other sources should be contributing to the conversation with strategy, absolutely, because management should know better about how the business operates, what the opportunities are, what new products and services they can build and make and deliver. Bring that into the strategy conversation. But the board needs to consider it, to interrogate it, to make it better, and then own it, because it's up to the board to hold the rest of the organization accountable to level it's never been held before. And that is done through the actions to deliver the strategy. The other part is leadership. So if the board is not seen within the organization, and even with the broader stakeholder environment, as being leaders, driving the business forward, upholding all of the rules and values, etc., from the highest possible level, then what happens is the rest of the organization doesn't buy into the strategy, they don't deliver it, they're not committed. There's no momentum that builds from the flow of information coming out of the board. And the other part obviously is governance. So making sure that we're following the rules, that we're developing policies so the organization itself has rules to follow, whether it's the legal stuff like Companies Act, or whether it's making sure that you're fulfilling your piece of the King 4, or whether there's other industry things that you need to do, making sure that governance is properly implemented. So it's strategy, leadership, and governance, not just governance. And what is governance? Well, it comes from the root word Kubernetes from Greek and Kubinari from Latin. And the concept is that it was about steering or piloting a ship, directing, ruling, guiding. So governance is about exactly that, directing, ruling, and guiding. So if you think about the early concept of having a ship leaving a harbor, it was operated and run by the crew, but it was managed and the direction was set by the captain and the officers. So think about the analogy of the shareholder director manager. The shareholders were the people who invested in the ship. They decided what type of ship it was, what its purpose was, and maybe its ultimate destination. So is it going to the east? Is it going to the west? What kind of products are we going to travel or transport? As soon as that ship leaves the harbor, shareholders cannot influence anything. So they've set the boundaries, they've set the framework, they've made sure that the ship is the right ship for the role, but it's then up to the captain and the officers to look at the environment, to understand what are the capabilities of this ship, to understand what the outcome is. So we need to get to X, the weather's coming in, can we get there? Do we need to make a detour? Do we need to change something? So they're managing and directing from a strategic perspective to make sure the ship reaches its outcome, reaches its end port. And then the crew, the management, make sure it happens. Put the sails up, put the oars out, whatever it might be to make sure that the ship moves in the direction it needs to go. But the important part is, just like a business, as soon as the ship has set sail, as a shareholder, you should not be and legally cannot be involved in the operations, because you break that veil. You're no longer seen as just a shareholder. You start to get into the murky waters of, are you acting as a director? Are you acting as a manager? So let's get into that now. So the three hats. What we mean by the three hats is these three different groupings. So any guesses what this grouping is? This grouping is shareholders. And the reason why we've chosen different colored blobs, different size blobs, squares, circles, ovals, is because shareholders come in all shapes and sizes, and they have different voting rights. So they're not equal unless they have equal shares. Meanwhile, the board is a team of equals. It's a circle, because no one at board level has any more or less power than anyone else. Management, now we have a bit of a hierarchy, because it doesn't matter how flat the organization, there always needs to be someone in charge, and there needs to be a reporting lines, because it's really difficult to effectively manage more than 4 or 5 people. So it ends up being a pyramid. It doesn't matter how you try, how hard you try. So shareholders at the top, board in the middle, and ideally you should have a board that's an odd number, because if you ever get to a vote, then you don't get hung votes and all the rest of it. But the idea of, if you're operating in a team, then you need to, as far as possible, come to a compromise and come to a unanimous decision. And then the management focus is through the managing director or CEO to the board. Now, there's a hard line between shareholders and the board because of what I mentioned earlier about the limited rights of being a shareholder. So by owning a share, you don't own the company, you own a basket of rights. So you've put money in, or you've put time in, and the return has been you've been allocated some shares. You've got a share certificate. What that means is you have a right to a return on your investment. So you should be getting a dividend, the company should be growing, something to indicate that there's been some kind of growth in your investment. And the other piece is that you have a right to remove or appoint directors. So is that really clear in how that works in your MOI and your shareholders agreement? Is it confusing because the two don't talk to each other properly? One is trying to override the other, but in law now, it's the wrong way around. All of those kind of confusions can just make noise, and if there's a problem down the line, it makes it really difficult to sort it out. So make sure that everything to do with the shareholders is clear in terms of how do you appoint and how do you remove directors if necessary. How do you buy and sell shares if it comes to that? What happens if someone dies? And then the other piece is, what kind of return do you want from the organization as a shareholder? Have you thought about this? Have you sat in a room with only the shareholders present, with your shareholders hat firmly on, and had a discussion about what do we want to get out of this organization? What is the dividend we expect to get every year? What kind of growth in asset value are we expecting to get every year? And then write it down. And even if it's exactly the same people that are serving on the board, you take that piece of paper and then move to a different room and now have a board meeting to discuss what the shareholders have told you about their expectations. If the shareholder representatives, whether it be a trust representative or the shareholder themselves, starts acting like a director, they will be seen as being deemed a director. So it's really important, if you want to protect your asset, if you want to protect your wealth in a trust, etc., you need to make sure there's a really clear distinction between what the shareholder is saying and what the director is saying. So it helps to have other shareholders other than just the same people on the board. It helps to have other directors other than just the same people that are shareholders, to try and break these pieces into their respective components. And then there's a dotted line between the board and management, because there's continuous communication that should be going up and down. There shouldn't be overlap of roles. We need to understand what our roles and responsibilities are, but there's communication that happens backwards and forwards. And with the managing director is always and should always be on the board. So you have some overlap as well in terms of the people. All three of these have a relationship with the company. But as I touched on with shareholders, the relationship is different for each. So with the shareholders, it's very much a selfish relationship. I've put money in, I've put my time in to build this thing, and now I want a return on my investment. With the board, it's a selfless relationship. You are doing everything in your capacity in the best interest of the business, not yourself. And the law talks to this a lot, which we'll touch on a little bit more in a minute, about what are your duties as a director. And one of the key things is this conflict of interest stuff. Because you need to be selfless, you need to be doing everything in the business's interest, which means you need to be doing everything as far as possible to avoid a conflict with your personal interest, up to the point where if there is a conflict, you need to leave the room. And again, if everybody's in the same boat, everyone in the room as a director is conflicted by a particular decision, then how do you move forward? You need to bring in independence, you need to bring in independent directors ideally, so that the process can continue and the risks are reduced as much as possible. And this is one of the components which, again, we'll touch on in a minute, where the is it still safe to be a director comes in. Because previously, a lot of these rules didn't apply. The risks of being a director, of being sued by the myriad of people that can sue you now, just didn't apply. So it's vital to understand how you manage the roles and responsibility of a director to limit that risk as far as possible. And management has both relationships because there's a contract in place. So contract means that you are acting selflessly. These are my roles and responsibilities as a manager. I need to deliver against those roles and responsibilities in order to keep my job. However, if the company stops paying me, then very quickly, or if I don't get promoted when I thought I should, or someone else gets promoted above me, then the selfish part kicks in really fast. So both of those are there all the time, pulling against each other. So if you're wearing all three of these hats, it's really, really important when you're in a discussion, making a decision, to understand which one you're wearing. Am I thinking selfishly here because I'm wearing my shareholder hat? I don't want to put money into the business right now. I don't want to do this deal that reduces our profit right now. Or you thinking as a director, where I have to take that selfish hat off. I have to leave it to one side, and I need to think what's in the best interest of the business, and only that. Or am I thinking from my manager hat, thinking, well, sure, if you make this decision, I'm going to get a whole bunch more work. And if we decide to remove these people from our team, then what's going to happen? How am I going to keep running the business, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We need to remove those hats and focus on what decision we're making as a director, to make sure that, as I said, it's in the best interest of the business, and only the best interest of the business. So what happens if you're wearing all three of these hats? So for those of you who are in that place, if there's general conversation, it tends to fall like water to the lowest common denominator, which is operational. So the board meetings tend to be very operational. We're talking about the minutiae of the way the business is operating. We're not stepping out of that and making strategic decisions. As soon as the argument starts happening, then it's like hot air. It rises to the highest common denominator, which may be shareholders. So we start saying, no, but it's my business, or I'm the majority shareholder, therefore. As soon as you start having those kind of conversations in what's supposed to be a board meeting, then you're not operating effectively. So it's really key to think about, how do you bring an independent perspective into the board? How do you think about when you're ready and how do you bring in independent directors onto the board. The intention is not for them to take over control. The intention is for them to help you make better decisions by bringing alternate, independent, external perspectives to the decision-making process, and not wearing the other hats makes that so much easier. And just to get the point across, in case you weren't aware, you cannot own a business, just as you cannot own a human being. So yes, you are a shareholder, but you do not own the assets of the business. You own a set of rights, as we discussed earlier. So as a shareholder, it doesn't matter whether you are the sole shareholder, the majority shareholder, you cannot treat those assets as your own. It has to be, everything has to be done in the best interest of the business, and the business owns those assets. So their use is for the business's benefit, not the individual's benefit. They are a juristic person. The business is a juristic person. Just another way of representing the engagement between the three hats. So shareholders and managers aren't linked. There is no direct connection between them. Their communication happens through the board, through the directors. So the shareholders invest for return. The director champions the promise, as we said before. So the entrepreneur comes up with the promise, then the directors champion that promise and make sure the organization is driving and achieving that goal, and the manager brings the promise to life. There's a download that you can have of this, a summary of this book, The Law of Three Hats, in the Laws of Extreme Business Success. So I'll open up that up at the end so you can download it. The idea is really that if you don't understand how to keep these separate, then you're really never going to take the business to the level of success that it can be, because they're always conflicting with each other. They're causing confusion in the organization. The organization is not in flow because people don't clearly understand what their roles and responsibilities are. And being an entrepreneurship is like climbing. So a lot of the analogy that we use as Sirdar, which I don't think I mentioned earlier, was the Sirdar is the lead Sherpa on a mountain expedition. So climbing a mountain is similar to building a business. They're both difficult. You need to plan. You need to have the right equipment. You need to have the right training. You need to have the right people. And the best way to learn how to climb is to learn from someone who's been there before. And the same applies to business. So too often we try and reinvent things that have been done before. So get advice, get a coach, get a mentor, read as an entrepreneur to make sure you're not repeating the mistakes that other people have already learned from and got the answers to. Director's duties. So very quickly, the main director's duties, so please understand these. If you've filled in that CIPC form and you are registered as a director, you need to understand this. There's two components. One is the duty of care, skill, and diligence, which I'll go to in a little bit more detail. And then there's the fiduciary duties, which are to act in good faith, act in the best interests of the company, avoid conflicts of interest just now, and to not use the position for personal gain. So if you're going into a conversation with someone outside the organization, say, look, so I'm MD of so-and-so, can you give me a better deal? Or if I have a word with one of my clients and they're like, can you give me a better deal? That is absolutely against what the Companies Act is saying, and certainly what governance is trying to communicate. It comes back to, as long as you remember you're doing everything in the best interest of the business, then you won't go too far wrong. As soon as there's any other kind of agenda, then it becomes a wobbly path, and at some point you're going to get caught out. And now the law has clause to make you a delinquent director, to fine you for that, for whatever damages were caused, etc., which it didn't have before. So in order to be safe as a director, you need to understand these rules and play by these rules and make sure that whenever you're making a decision, you've documented them effectively so that anybody coming back in a few years' time can see, okay, you made a mistake. The Companies Act allows you to make mistakes, but how did you come to that decision in the first place? Did you follow a reasonable process? Did you really think it through? Did you get outside advice, etc.? And if it's just written down, even in summary form, if it's written down somewhere and you have it as board minutes, then you're going to be in a much better space. You're going to be in a much safer space than if you haven't. And the care, skill, and diligence piece is the whole idea of how you approach decision making. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of making sure you've written things down, make sure there's a process around a decision. So is there just something, do you have a board meeting? If not, then formalize that. Whenever you make a decision, have a board meeting that's at least documented. On this date, at this time, these people were present, so it was resolved that, boom. It can be one page, but please make sure that you write this stuff down. It's become more and more important. So it's care in terms of the approach to decision making. So have you thought things through? Have you had a proper discussion about the pros and cons of the idea? As I said, have you got some kind of external opinion, if it's appropriate, to make sure that you're making the right decision from a... So if anyone else comes and looks at that decision, there's a reasonable man test. If anyone comes and looks at that decision, they say, yes, okay. They really thought this through, and unfortunately it didn't work out. Or well done, it worked out fantastically well. But at least we can go back and we can see what process we followed so that we can repeat it in the future, or we can avoid it in the future, depending on what the outcome was. And skill, knowledge, commercial acumen, self-development. Am I, as a director, keeping up with my learning? Have I got sufficient commercial acumen? Am I doing whatever I need to do to understand all the components of a business? Have I been exposed to the marketing aspect? Have I been and sat with the marketing department to get an understanding of how that operates? And not meddling with the operations, just understanding the components of the business. Am I doing self-development? Am I going on courses and making sure that I'm up to date with best practices in terms of governance and directed process, etc.? Have I got good knowledge and understanding of my industry? Am I making sure I'm learning and learning and learning so that I can see opportunities when they come up? And then diligence is the preparation and attention to detail. So if you're having a board meeting, am I preparing properly? Am I reading the board papers? Am I interrogating the agenda? Am I coming into the meeting with questions? Am I looking at the detail? Do I understand the financials? So no, you can't rely on the financial manager anymore to do all of that thinking and reporting. You need to understand and be able to dig into the financials. And now it's getting to the point where it's extensively recognized that governance increases the bottom line. So we're proving now again and again and again, the companies that are failing in the newspapers, it says governance issue, problem with the board, etc., etc., etc. every day, which is an indication that if you get the governance right, then there's far higher likelihood of the bottom line being improved as well. Because you're effective in the board, you're not just ticking boxes. You're adding value as a board member. You're not just ticking boxes. So when you're building a board, what do we need to do? We need to make sure that we've got people around the table who are adding value. And how do we do that? Well, we're starting from the outside in. We look at the different types of directors. So we make sure that we've got a combination of executive directors and non-executive directors. So King 3 and 4 talks about them being a majority of directors are non-executive, and of the non-execs, the majority are independent. So one of the reasons why I used 5 directors in the previous slide, because it's a fairly easy way of building a board. If you've got the managing director who's on the board, you've got one other executive or non-executive director possibly, but usually one other executive, might be the financial manager, or it could be someone else in the organization who is very strategically inclined, and it could be the marketing manager or one of those people. But it's start with 2 executives. Then if you've got a board of 5, you've now got the opportunity to have 3 non-executives, of which 2 are independent. First and foremost, make sure you've got an independent chairman. Coming into a board meeting as an independent chairman, you see so many things that if you're in the trenches, you just cannot see. Also, when you're handling the conversations and managing the meeting, there's far less emotional engagement with the other shareholder hats and the management hats and the previous issues that have got the company to its current state. So you can move through that murky water a lot more easily than if you aren't independent, if you've had some prior connection to the business. And ideally to have at least one other independent director, so that you've got a bit of a balance. It's not just the executive directors meeting with so-and-so. It's properly split, and there's a balance, a weight of non-executive director thinking that can help temper the enthusiasm and the maybe rushing into the next thing that the executive directors tend to do. So it's not necessarily squashing things, it's not slowing things down unless it's needed. The idea is you've got a better team that helps support the management to do a better job. And from the inside, what we're looking at is your energy, your values, certainly, your skills, definitely, but also we want to understand how you operate in a team. And I know Enshrine use this particular tool, Contribution Compass, for their recruitment process for the same reason. So we use it extensively at Sirdar for boards, because we've come to understand that it's really important to understand who's in the room and what will they do in a critical moment and what questions will they ask. So the first question, obviously, everyone needs to ask is, why are we doing what we're doing? But the next question, if you get into flow, the next question should be, what are we going to do next? And the activating energy personality profiles, that's their question. They need that question answered before they can move on. The inspiring energy question is who? It's a people energy. So activating is about igniting change. It's about doing new things, chasing after the next shiny thing. Inspiring energy is much more around the people. So what are the people saying? What are the people doing? What am I sensing when I go into walk around the factory floor? What can I hear? It's an auditory learning a bit as well. And it's very much answering that who question. So if we talk about what are we going to do? So for example, we need to open a new office. So that's our what. Then we think about, well, who's going to support that? Who have we got available? Do we need to recruit someone who's going to move to head up that new office? But then we need to know when and where we're going to open that office. Certainly start with the who, but then the next question has to be when and where. Otherwise, you've just got too many other problems you need to work through. So now we've decided, okay, Joe's going to do it, and it's going to be in Durban, and we're going to aim to open the office next year. Great. Only then can we truly, with effectiveness, dive into the how are we going to do it. So it's really important as a board that you understand who's sitting around the table and what their question is, so that you can make sure that we start with the activating what, we move into the inspiring who, we understand the sustaining when and where, and then we get into the how. We don't jump straight from what to how, because it just kills the energy. So sitting around the table, this is the Contribution Compass profiling tool. These are the different profiles. And sitting around the table, it's important to understand what each person's primary profile is, because you'll quickly see, so for example, businesses are typically started by high activating catalysts or possibly champions if it's marketing driven and sales driven. And they often form the first two that may form an organization. And then you bring in the high refining conductor to manage the books. If you put it on a diagram like this, it's really clear there's a big gap. And the gap typically happens in terms of understanding the way we're bringing people into the organization, the way we're managing people, the way we're making them effective, the way we're connecting people to the sustaining energy is about the assets of the business, the services and the customers of the business. So are we working with the customers effectively? Are we delivering to the customers effectively? Are we retaining them effectively? That's what a custodian or sustaining energy does well. So if we don't have all of these pieces at board level, then how on earth are we going to make sure that we're covering all of these bases when we're making decisions? And what typically happens with a high activating energy board, and I happen to be a high activating energy, and I've been on a very high activating energy board, and what happens is we create new things all the time. We start new projects. We start new ways of doing things. We check and drive the new shiny thing. We need that sustaining energy to bring us back down to ground level and say, guys, we haven't thought about the when and the where. We haven't thought about actually if we just need to tweak and adjust the process that we've been following or the way the service is delivered. That's how we shift the profit needle. We don't need to come up with a complete new idea. So if you don't have that balance at board level, where else are you going to have it that can help drive the best possible decisions? So this links to what we've called the Sirdar governance compass, and the two fit on top of each other. So activating energies are very good at driving the strategy and the direction of an organization, The champion profile in particular is good with understanding the organizational culture, the branding, sales, etc. The coach profile is very good at understanding and driving the people, which is the effective leadership piece. And so it goes around the circle. And as a board, we need to understand these 8 segments and make sure that we're talking about them at least once a year. They're all really important. It's not just strategy and direction, maybe, and then we go dive into the financials. We've got to cover all of these bases throughout the course of the year, and that's the board's job. So are you ready for a board? So obviously the key thing, if you get the board right, then it enhances the performance of the business. It's really great way of planning for succession, because you now have a company that's run by a team. Then taking an individual out is much easier. So if, as a founder, you don't really want to sell the business because it's going well, it's generating cash and profits, it's paying out good dividends, I want to move into the shareholder space rather than being in the management. And now I have a choice of whether, should I serve on the board? Do I want to get involved with the strategic conversations? Can I contribute? Make a decision? Yes, I can. But if you're running the board properly, then it certainly helps and avoids a lot of the domination that tends to happen in the decision making. And it makes it much easier for the people who are taking over the organization to understand where that direction is coming from, because it's coming from a group, it's better defined. And then you can slowly move out into just being a shareholder, whatever the next phase might be, or diving back into management because you really enjoy a particular role in the business, whether it's new technologies or marketing or sales or something that you've always enjoyed. So it just makes succession planning and planning in general that much easier. And next stage of growth. So often a business gets stuck, and it's stuck because the people who've taken it to that level don't know how to take it to the next level. So if you bring in independent directors who've been to the next level, who can help lift you to that next level, then it breaks through that glass ceiling. And the other aspect, which is obviously very relevant now, is a critical turnaround. So again, if you're bringing other perspectives in, independent perspectives into the room when you're having those strategic conversations, then there's more likelihood that you're going to think of something, going to pivot, you're going to move in a different direction and turn that organization around. See something that's not obvious because you're too close to it. And generational change. So we work quite a lot with second and third generation businesses, and it's that handover. So the person who's founded the business, they've communicated maybe to the next generation what it's all about, but the handover to the third generation, they're starting to lose understanding of what this business is really about and what its promise is. And now you move to fourth generation. There's a lot of them in the fourth generation now, and they've got different ideas. They want to do different things. They may not want to be involved in the organization at all. So if it's driven by a professional board, then it makes it much easier for people to take the role that they are best suited to. And preparation for sale. Investors want to see transparency. They want to see that organization is being run well. And if you have an effective board that's documenting things effectively, that's making decisions effectively, you've got clean financials, it makes it so much easier to sell the business because it's more transparent what someone is buying, what they're investing in. And that gives the confidence to the investors that they're making the right choice in putting money into this organization, either to buy it out completely or just to buy a share. So if majority shareholder is also the director, does he or she control the decisions of the board? Well, the answer is no. Not only do you put your shareholding entity at risk, but you also destroy the value of effective governance, because there's now confusion in the organization as who's driving this organization. Is it the majority shareholder? Is it the board? Is it the MD? We don't know. All we know is that they come and wander around the factory floor and they say, do this and do that, and we all jump, and then they go away and someone else comes in and tells us to do something different. But most importantly, it breaks down that solid line, that line that stops your liability, limits your liability, why you put your business in PTY and limited in the first place. It limits the liability so that if the business goes down, all you lose is the money you've put in, nothing else. Whereas a director, if the business goes down, you've got a probability or possibility of losing a lot more than that, because there may be a damages claim or something else that goes with it. So it's really important, if you've got to protect your asset, to make sure that that shareholding is distinctly separate from the operations of the business. Should the first directors be industry experts? No, because if you're a baker, the discussion becomes about baking better bread. We want to make sure that we're bringing in external perspectives to think about how to run the whole business more effectively at director level, not just to build a better product. And is the business performance affected by a combination of directors and natural energy? Yes, absolutely. And we've seen a direct correlation, and I know I've felt that direct correlation when I've served on boards as a chairman, that if you don't have a balance of energy, then it takes the company in a particular direction, and it's really difficult to bring it back, and needs an awful lot of discipline. Whereas if you've got a balanced board, then it happens much more naturally. Everyone's much more in their flow. So it's no longer business as usual. It's time to question everything. And I think right now is certainly a time to question everything. So what can we do better as business leaders? What can we do better as directors in the organizations that we're working with? How do we make sure as a shareholder we are appointing the right directors to the companies that we're shareholders of, etc.? And how do I become a value-adding director? It requires time, it requires energy, and it requires guidance. And ultimately, it's a commitment. Being a director now is very different from being a director a few years ago. It takes a lot more time, a lot more commitment, and there's potentially a lot more risk. So you need to know what you're doing. So it's preparation at base camp, not during the climb, that gets you to the summit. So how do you build that framework? How do you build that base? How do you make sure you've got the right kit, the right training, etc., before you climb? So takeaways: follow a defined methodology, making sure you've got a clear idea of how this thing works, an effective process. So are you having meetings at particular times? Are they well mapped out? Have you got a calendar for the year? Have you got pre-board meetings happening? Are you getting the minutes sorted out quickly after the board meeting? Make sure you choose your directors wisely. So don't just look at their skill and ability, but make sure that you've got a values fit and you've got a profile fit. And embrace the long term. This is not a quick fix. Getting governance right is a long-term solution. Understand the role of shareholder director manager, wear the right hat at the right time, making sure you're making decisions with a clear understanding of which hat you're wearing, and recognize you do not own your business. So if you want to become an independent director, then it's important to be a generalist, not a specialist, because you need to have a really good understanding of all the aspects of the business so you can add value. Continuously do professional and personal development. Keep reading, keep doing courses. You need to be top of your game. And when the society generally and governance generally is moving much more towards professional directors. So you need to make sure that you're getting all of those aspects covered off. Focus on commercial acumen and thinking as an independent director. Leave the ego at the door. There is no place for it. So please put in your chat box, what was your biggest insight today? What are the next steps you want to take? If you want to find out any more about director programs. So we'll take questions in a second. What I just wanted to mention is I'll be staying on the call for another 10-15 minutes afterwards. We've got 2 possible training options, one for a one-day workshop and one for our full 11-month training program, which is what a lot of independent directors do, and executive directors who really want to take their business to the next level are doing. So if you want to find out more about that, stay on the line, and immediately after questions, we'll go through and I'll just give you a bit more detail about that. So questions, who have we got on chat? Let's see if we can. Okay. Any questions? Any questions? Yep, so we will be doing recording. We have been doing a recording this. Also, there's one I did a week ago, slightly different, so it might be worth you watching both to find out what I said differently in the first one compared with this one. Any particular questions about directorship in general? Great, okay, then the offers. So we've got some files. I'll just share this so that there's the copy of LEBS if you want to download it. I'm just going to share this brochure from the Applied Directorship Program, which I'll touch on now, and the details of the High Performance Board workshop, so you should be able to download those. And I'll just start this offer. So the first one I want to talk about, is there anybody still online who wants to hear a little bit more about? Yes, we've got a few people. Okay, then I'll just go quickly into the different workshops. So the offer is, I'll load it, for this thing to work, start offer, publish. So the first thing we want to talk about is the one-day workshop. So we call it Growing Companies Through a High Performance Board. And the idea is it's a very interactive workshop. It's not a webinar. There's questions, there's work examples, and we found that actually even on Zoom it works quite effectively because it allows you to do small breakaway groups. So you can put into pairs, you can put into groups, you can work through an example and then come back into the room to give your feedback. It covers 4 main sessions. So a lot of what we've talked about today, we go into in a lot more detail. So the 3 hats, the director's duties, etc. Then the second part of the morning is around the types of directors. So digging into what are the responsibilities of an executive director versus an independent director? What is the definition of independence? How do you know whether you're independent or not, etc. Digging into how that relationship between the chairman and the CEO works. So examples of an agenda for that chairman-CEO meeting that you should be having before the board agenda is finalized. Go into a full case study about how to put together a board. So we let you choose the directors, and then we have a conversation about how the different teams fared and how you came to those conclusions, and key misconceptions, general assumptions, etc. And then the other part in the afternoon is going through the foundations of the board process. So going through what are the foundational documents need to be in place, what does the process look like throughout the year? How does the rhythm work of pre-board, board, etc.? And then at the end of the year, what should you be doing in terms of checking in? So a board evaluation, those kind of things that happen at the end of the year, your annual review part. And then the last piece is going through the 8 segments of what I showed earlier, which was the governance compass, and digging into the whys and wherefores and some questions and templates and checklists for you to go and fill in related to those different segments. So you get a much better understanding of where your business is at and what you need to do next. So it becomes your roadmap to take your business forward. So ridiculously cheap offer at the moment. We are offering it today, and I'll keep the offer open tomorrow. That's the link. I can put that link in the chat box, just so you've got easy access to it. Oops. Chat. So if you're interested, that offer will be open today and tomorrow. Normally, as I said, it's 3,800. The program takes place on the 9th of June. If you can't make it on the 9th of June, we can roll you over to the July one, but the important thing is to register as soon as possible. Just spotted a question, sorry, Dion. Special measures by board during COVID. So what's happened in the boards that I'm serving on is that we've had special meetings, the first thing. So this is not regular, wait 3 months before you have your next meeting stuff. This is have a meeting as often as you possibly can. And a lot of the strategic conversation has been around what has changed, what are the risks of our customers. So what is the risk to us if a customer fails, and what is the risk of that customer failing? So that you can start to map out, okay, we need to make sure that we've covered off, we've found new clients to replace that one. So if you're in an industry where you've lost most of your revenue, obviously it's a little bit more fundamental pivot you need to make, but it's making sure that you really understand where you're at, what are the potential risks, and then now start to think and go through particular mitigating measures. Do we need to come up with another product service? Is there something we can do with our current capacity that will generate revenue? Are we okay? I mean, that's a big question that we've asked come back and the answer was yes. Almost to everyone's surprise, 2 of the organizations I'm on, they're actually saying, well, no, we're okay. And in fact, we're probably doing quite well because we're in the industries that are supporting a lot of the health sector or the large chain store sector, and then helping and improving their deliveries or their ability to sell to clients, whatever it might be. So that's part of this whole understanding what you can and should be doing as a director, making sure you're talking strategy all the time, making sure you're supporting management wherever you possibly can, giving them access to networks, giving them advice based on past experience. All of that stuff comes to play to make sure that you're doing everything in the best interest of the business to keep the business going. So how do we have a conversation with the staff about possible reduction in wages? How do we make sure we keep as many staff on the payroll as we possibly can? Have those tough conversations. Make a decision, move on. You haven't got time to waste to procrastinate and all that kind of stuff. So I hope that gives you some idea, Dion. Yeah, it's tough times, and there's lots of webinars on our website that talk to that. There's a webinar on when do you start thinking about business rescue, not necessarily pulling the trigger, but when you start thinking about the process, because it's a great way of understanding where your business is at. And then you're ready. If you need to go into business rescue, then you've done the background, and it can be a fairly straightforward process. There's also some webinars about how to lead and how to drive boards in COVID, et cetera, et cetera. So have a look at the resources webinars page on our website. Then the next piece of this was Applied Directorship Program, which is the 11-month program. And the idea of this was to take you on a journey of first getting the grounds foundations. So again, we keep bashing away at this 3-hat story and having different examples of wearing the 3 hats and how it feels to be wearing one hat versus another in a conversation, to just make sure that it's real. It's not just a theoretical concept. So we go through, in that first session, we go through a worked example where you have a conversation with a shareholder hat on. What are the questions you ask? What are the things you're worried about with that hat on? Then have the same conversation about the same topic with a different hat on, and experience what that feels like, because it is different. You have different things you need to know, different questions you need to ask. So set the foundation in module 1. Module 2, we go through a lot more detail about contribution compass and the building of a board. So how does that contribution compass come to play, the skills, etc. And go through a worked example again, so that when you get into module 3, when you actually have a board meeting, you understand how your groups were put together. So the idea is we have a cohort of between 15 and 20, so that's 4, maybe 5 boards. In the module 3, you were put into your boards using everything you've learned in module 2 to determine the blend of people that are in that board. So you've got different contribution compass profiles. You've got different skills. You come from different industries, preferably. And then you, as a team, from module 3 onwards, have a board meeting every month for 8 months. So we have facilitated sessions for 4 hours every month online, and then the rest of the materials are online, videos, audios, reading, self-reflection exercise, etc. So then you have 8 board meetings going around the the governance compass. So it's strategy, then it's culture, then it's executive performance. And along with the shift in the board meetings, the subjects and topics and videos that you watch each month are related to that topic. So there's a wealth of information on the online Moodle platform that talks to each of these particular concepts. And in terms of fees, so the offer today, just looking at those numbers now, we can only hold this price for 2 days, because on the 1st of June, it goes up to the dollar price, which is at the moment equivalent to 66,000. Because it's online, we've been stuck in court in South Africa because our Ghana office and our Kenya office are bleating that, why do you get such a good rate in South Africa where everyone else in the rest of the organization has been paying much higher values? So this is actually a compromise price between what the other African cohorts have been paying compared to what we've been paying in South Africa. So this 49,375 is available for this week. And that's the registration. and we'll see when we go to the registration, it marks the time, so I'll know whether it was in time or not. The program starts on the 11th of June, but again, if that's going to be too quick, then we start a new program in July as well. The great thing about online, which is we hadn't really thought about when we moved everybody from face-to-face programs to online, was that now we've got the opportunity to bring in people from all over the world into a particular cohort. So we've got people from the Kenyan office, we've got people from Ghana, we've got people from all over the rest of Africa, as well as South Africa and Cape Town, Joburg, Durban, Limpopo, wherever it might be, who would have really struggled maybe to have attended the face-to-face session in the individual cities. So we've ended up with a much broader blend of experiences and size of organizations and geographic locations. So it's been fantastic networking opportunities and learning opportunities to get to hear from all of those other people. So those are the offers today. As I said, please, that's the high performance board one. Apparently I need to remove that before I can do the other one. So that's the applied directorship program offer is there, so you can see the click to register, and that'll take you to the registration page, or it's on the slide as well. Any other questions? Anything else on chat? Anyone? Anyone? Closing, going. So I said, yes, there will be a recording. We can arrange for the slides. I think they'll have to be emailed to you. So Enshrine team, if you can just make a note of those who wanted the slides, and we can arrange for them to be emailed. And then if you need to get in contact with me, my details are here. Drop me a line, give me a phone call, check on our website. And hopefully that was valuable and helps challenge you, shift your thinking, get you excited about becoming a director in the future if you're not one already. And yes, if you want to take it further, if you want to join our director database, if you want to find out more about our training programs or just generally support for boards and directors, then let me know. Thanks very much. Bye for now.